On a prosperous farm, an 8-year-old orphan girl begs for food for her hungry little sister, but the millionaire farmer rejects her with contempt. When hunger becomes unbearable, the child invades the property to take some eggs. Discovering the invasion, the furious man sets a cruel trap and corners the girl in the stable. He grabs a glowing hot cattle branding iron, his eyes gleaming with sadistic satisfaction as he approaches the terrified child. "But you're going to learn to never steal from me again," he growls, raising the red-hot metal. But when he's about to brand the girl forever, a white horse, witnessing all the cruelty, makes a decision that will change everything. Before we begin, if you love animals as much as we do, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of our emotional stories. Thank you. Now, back to our story. The morning sun bathed the golden gates of Blackwood Ranch as two small figures appeared on the dusty road. Isabella walked slowly, her bare feet stepping carefully on the hot stones of the pavement. In her arms, she carried Sophia, her 4-year-old sister, whose weight seemed to increase with every step under the scorching heat. The two girls stood in brutal contrast to the opulence that lay beyond the ornate gates. While the property boasted perfectly manicured gardens, marble fountains, and a mansion that looked like a palace, they wore faded, patched clothes with holes that told stories of need and neglect. Isabella paused at the gates, gazing at the distance between her world and this earthly paradise. Her brown eyes, too large for her thin face, held a determination that shouldn't exist in an 8-year-old. Sophia whimpered softly, pressing her empty stomach against her older sister's chest. "Shh, little one," Isabella whispered, adjusting the child in her trembling arms. "We're going to get food today, I promise." She approached the gates and pressed the golden bell. The sound echoed across the property like a silent cry for help. Minutes passed before an imposing figure emerged on the flagstone path leading to the main entrance. Edward Sinclair walked with the posture of a man born to command. His impeccably tailored navy suit cost more than most families in the county saw in an entire year. His Italian leather shoes shone as brightly as his superior attitude, and the gold watch on his wrist marked not just the hours, but the social distance between him and the rest of the world. At 52, Edward had built a cattle empire that spanned thousands of acres. His wealth was known throughout the state, as was his coldness toward those he considered inferior. To him, the poor were a blight that needed to be kept far from the perfection he had built with others, sweat and his own blood. "What do you want here?" he asked in a harsh voice, stopping a safe distance from the gates. His blue eyes, cold as ice, analyzed the girls as if they were undesirable insects. Isabella swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Please, sir," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We haven't eaten in 3 days. My little sister is very weak. Could you spare some scraps? Anything will do." She held out a small, cracked plastic container through the bars of the gates. Her hands trembled so much that the container swayed like a leaf in the wind. Sophia lifted her head and looked at the man with eyes glazed over by hunger. Not understanding why this person wouldn't help them immediately, Edward observed the scene with growing contempt. "Scraps," he repeated, as if the word were a curse. "Do you think this property is a garbage dump? That I'm some kind of charitable person who hands out alms to vagrants?" "We're not vagrants, sir," Isabella replied with a courage that surprised even herself. "We're orphans. Our parents died in the highway accident. We don't have anyone else. And that's my problem." Edward crossed his arms, the fabric of his suit stretching over his chest, puffed with arrogance. "Everyone has to look out for themselves. If you don't have food, it's because you haven't tried hard enough. Life doesn't owe anyone a thing." Sophia began to cry louder, the weak sound echoing in the silent morning. Isabella rocked her gently, feeling tears burn her own eyes. "Please," she tried one more time. "Ah, she's just a baby. She can't starve to death because of us." "Get off my property immediately!" Edward shouted, his voice reverberating like thunder. "If I see you here again, I'll call the police. I don't want beggars dirtying up the view from my house." He turned his back and started walking back to the mansion, each step echoing like a death sentence for the two children. Isabella stood motionless for a few minutes, watching him disappear among the ornamental trees, feeling something die inside her small chest. But as she walked back down the dusty road, carrying a softly crying Sophia, a seed of determination began to sprout in her heart. That night, when the hunger became unbearable and her little sister's whimpers echoed through the darkness of their shack, Isabella would make a decision that would change everything. The smell of money wafting from the ranch contrasted sharply with the odor of misery that followed them. But the 8-year-old girl didn't know that her next choice would trigger a series of events that would shake the foundations of that seemingly unshakable inequality. Hunger, she would soon discover, can turn even the weakest into desperate warriors. Night fell over the plywood shack like a heavy blanket of despair. Isabella sat on the dirt floor, rocking Sophia, who wouldn't stop crying. Her little sister's weak moans echoed off the thin walls, mingling with the distant chirp of crickets and the wind whistling through the cracks. "I'm hungry, Bella," Sophia murmured between sobs, using the affectionate nickname she had created for her older sister. Her cheeks, once chubby and pink, now seemed sunken, and her large eyes shone with a feverish light that frightened Isabella. "I know, little one," Isabella whispered, running her fingers through her sister's tangled hair. "We'll find food tomorrow. I promise you." But as she spoke, her own stomach contracted painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in 3 days either. Their last meal had been a piece of stale bread a kind neighbor had given them, carefully divided into small pieces to last as long as possible. Isabella looked around the shack they called home. The walls were made of old planks carelessly nailed together, with gaps that let in wind, rain, and cold. In the corner, a thin, stained mattress served as a bed for both of them. An old paint can served as a table, and their only possessions were a few donated clothes and a tattered blanket that had belonged to their mother. The memory of their parents still hurt like an open wound. The highway accident had happened 6 months ago, as they were returning from seasonal harvest work. A runaway truck had hit their old car head-on, instantly taking the only people the girls had in the world. Since then, Isabella had taken on the role of mother, sister, and protector to Sophia. At 8 years old, she carried a weight that would make adults crumble. She begged on the streets of town, collected cans to sell, and offered to do small jobs for food. But the region was poor, and people could barely support their own families. "Bella, my tummy hurts," Sophia whimpered, curling up even more in her sister's arms. Isabella felt her heart break once more. In that moment, an image flashed in her mind. The golden gates of Blackwood Ranch, the lush garden, and surely somewhere on that immense property, there had to be enough food to feed dozens of people. The rich rancher had been cruel and inhuman, but Isabella wasn't thinking of revenge. She was only thinking of Sophia's survival. If Edward Sinclair wouldn't give them food willingly, maybe there was a way to get it without him knowing. The idea was terrifying and dangerous, but the alternative was even worse. Isabella couldn't just stand by and watch her little sister wither away. She had promised her parents, on the day of their funeral, that she would take care of Sophia no matter what. "Sophia," she murmured, deciding to include her little sister in her desperate plan. "Do you remember the big ranch we visited today, with the golden gates?" The little girl nodded weakly, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "There must be lots of food there. Chickens, eggs, fruit on the trees. If we go at night, when the mean man is asleep, we can just take a little bit." just enough so you won't be hungry anymore." Sophia looked at her with wide eyes. Even at 4, she knew that taking things that weren't hers was wrong, but hunger was stronger than any moral lesson. "What if he catches us?" she asked in a trembling voice. Isabella swallowed hard. She was scared too, more scared than she had ever been in her life. But Sophia's constant crying, her growing weakness, and the prospect of watching her slowly starve to death were worse than any punishment. "He won't catch us," she said with a conviction she didn't feel. "We'll be very careful. We'll sneak in, grab a few eggs from the chicken coop and get out quickly, like silent little ghosts." Sophia tried to smile, imagining herself as a playful ghost. The idea seemed less frightening when Isabella described it as a game. "When are we going?" she asked, showing a touching confidence in her older sister. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is hidden behind the clouds and everyone is fast asleep." Isabella stayed awake the rest of the night, planning every detail of the raid. She knew the property from the outside, having walked around its walls several times looking for work or food. She knew where the chicken coop was, near the back of the main house, and had noticed that a section of the stone wall was slightly damaged, with enough space for 2 small children to slip through. Fear grew in her chest like a coiling snake, but her determination was even greater. She would do anything to save Sophia, even if it meant becoming something she never thought she would be, a desperate thief, driven by the unconditional love of an older sister. The next morning, as the sun rose, painting the sky gold, Isabella had already made the decision that would change their lives forever. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds when Isabella woke Sophia in the middle of the night. The silence was broken only by the distant chirp of a few crickets and the gentle wind rustling the trees around the shack. "It's time, little one," Isabella whispered, helping her sister up. Sophia was sleepy and confused, but her empty stomach quickly reminded her of their plan. Isabella grabbed the cracked plastic container and an old cloth bag she had found in the trash. Her hands trembled slightly, but she took a deep breath to calm herself. She had to be strong for Sophia. She had to be brave when every fiber of her being screamed to go back under the blanket and forget this madness. "Remember what we talked about?" she asked, kneeling in front of her little sister. "We're going to be as quiet as kittens. If I tell you to run, you run as fast as you can, understand?" Sophia nodded, her big eyes reflecting a mix of fear and trust in her sister. Isabella took her small hand, and the two left the shack, stepping carefully on the dry earth to avoid making noise. The walk to Blackwood Ranch took almost an hour. Isabella carried Sophia on her back for most of the way, feeling her own legs tremble with weakness. Hunger had sapped her strength, but determination kept her moving. When they reached the stone wall surrounding the property, Isabella quickly located the damaged section she had identified during her daytime wanderings. A few stones had fallen, creating an opening small enough for them to pass through. "Now we're entering the secret garden," she whispered to Sophia, trying to turn the raid into a magical adventure to lessen her sister's fear. "Remember, we're invisible fairies looking for treasure to save the kingdom." Sophia smiled weakly, clinging to the make-believe game. Isabella helped her through the opening first, then squeezed through the rough stones herself, feeling them scratch her thin skin through her clothes. Inside, the property was even more impressive than it seemed from the main gates. Perfectly tended gardens stretched in all directions, with fountains bubbling softly and stone paths winding through beds of exotic flowers. The main house loomed majestically in the distance, its dark windows like the closed eyes of a sleeping giant. Isabella quickly got her bearings and located the chicken coop at the back of the property. It was a well-kept structure, painted white with red trim, very different from the rickety coops she knew. It looked more like a chicken hotel than a simple shelter for birds. There, she pointed discreetly. Let's go slowly, tiptoe. The two girls moved like little shadows through the garden. Isabella's heart was beating so hard she was sure the sound was echoing across the entire property. Every noise, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the sound of her own breath seemed amplified in the dead of night. When they reached the chicken coop, Isabella found the door was locked with a simple padlock. For a moment, despair almost overcame her. She had come so far, risked so much, and now a small piece of metal stood between her and feeding Sophia. But then she noticed that one of the side windows of the coop was slightly ajar for ventilation. It was small, but Isabella was smaller. With great care, she managed to open the window just enough to slip through. "Stay here and keep watch," she whispered to Sophia. "If you see any lights turn on in the house, call me softly." The inside of the coop smelled of clean straw and quality feed. The chickens slept peacefully on well-built perches, some clucking softly as Isabella passed them. There were neat nests along the walls, and in many of them, Isabella could see the rounded shape of fresh eggs. With hands trembling from anxiety and gratitude, she began to carefully collect the eggs. She took only a few from each nest, hoping the difference wouldn't be noticed immediately. They were large eggs, with clean, smooth shells, very different from the small, dirty eggs she could sometimes buy at the market with coins found on the street. When she had filled the plastic container and the cloth bag, Isabella felt a wave of relief mixed with guilt. She knew she was stealing, breaking one of the most basic lessons her parents had taught her. But when she thought of Sophia's thin face, her stomach swollen with hunger, the guilt dissolved into the urgent need for survival. She climbed out of the window with extra care, holding the eggs as if they were precious treasures. "I got them," she whispered to Sophia, showing her the full container. "Let's go before anyone wakes up." The two began their walk back through the gardens, moving even more slowly so as not to shake the eggs. Isabella felt like a hero on a successful mission, saving her little sister from the hunger that had tormented them for days. But she didn't know that in one of the mansion's windows, a shadow had moved. Edward Sinclair, an insomniac, as he often was when planning new business deals, had noticed movement in the gardens. His cold eyes watched the two small figures move away toward the wall, and a cruel smile began to form on his lips. The girls had gotten the food they needed, but they had also planted the seeds of a revenge that would be far more bitter than they could imagine. The dawn brought the first decent meal the sisters had had in days. Isabella had cooked 3 eggs in an old can over a makeshift fire, dividing them carefully between herself and Sophia. The taste was like a miracle to their parched mouths, and for the first time in a long time, Sophia smiled genuinely. "It's yummy, Bella," the little girl said, licking her fingers so as not to waste a single drop of the golden yolk. Her cheeks seemed to have regained some of their pinkish color, and her eyes shone with renewed life. Isabella felt a complex mix of relief and anxiety. The night mission had been successful, but she knew she couldn't repeat the feat too many times without being discovered. She needed to find a more permanent solution to their hunger, but for now, seeing Sophia fed was a victory. Meanwhile, in the mansion at Blackwood Ranch, Edward Sinclair awoke with the first ray of sun that pierced his imported silk curtains. His first action, like every morning, was to conduct a rigorous inspection of his property. It was an obsessive ritual he had developed over the years, a need to control every detail of his personal empire. Edward put on his navy silk robe and genuine leather slippers before heading out to the garden. His steps were firm and determined as he walked the stone paths, checking that everything was in perfect order. The well-tended plants, the correctly functioning fountains, the lawns mowed with military precision. When he reached the chicken coop, His morning routine was brutally interrupted. The door was still locked, but the side window was slightly ajar. Edward frowned and unlocked the padlock, entering the structure to investigate. What he saw there made his blood boil. Several nests showed clear signs of being disturbed, eggs were missing, and there were small, dry dirt footprints on the clean floor of the coop. Someone had violated his property, invaded his private sanctuary, stolen his belongings. "How dare they?" he muttered through clenched teeth, his fists tightening in a growing rage. Edward had never tolerated disrespect, let alone theft. In his mind, the property was an extension of himself, and any invasion was a personal attack that demanded severe retaliation. He examined the footprints more closely, noticing they were too small to belong to an adult. Children, and not just any children. He had a very strong suspicion who was capable of such audacity. The memory of the two orphans at his gates the morning before came back to him like a bitter revelation. Those miserable girls had begged for food. He had refused them, as was his right, and now they had decided to simply take what they wanted. It was an intolerable affront to the natural order of things. Edward returned to the mansion with heavy, furious steps. In his luxurious office, lined with mahogany and decorated with trophies from his business achievements, he sat behind the massive oak desk and began to plan an appropriate response. "They think they can rob me and get away with it," he said to himself, drumming his fingers on the desk. "They're going to learn that actions have consequences. They're going to learn what happens when you mess with Edward Sinclair." His calculating mind went to work, developing a plan that would be both a trap and a lesson. He knew human nature, especially the desperate nature of poverty. He knew that if hunger struck again, the girls would return, and when they did, he would be waiting. Edward called his ranch manager, a burly man named Jake, who carried out his orders without question. "Jake, and I want you to spread the word in town that I'll be traveling on business next week. Say I'll be gone for at least 5 days." "Yes, sir. Any special reason?" Jake asked, used to his boss's eccentricities. "Just do as I say and get the back stable ready. I'll need the cattle brand good and hot. We have some wild animals that need to be tamed." Edward hung up the phone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't going on any trip. On the contrary, he would hide on the property, waiting patiently like a predator watching its prey. When the orphans returned, and he was sure they would, he would be ready to teach them a lesson they would never forget. The cattle brand was his favorite tool for educating those who disrespected his authority. He had used it on a few insubordinate employees in the past, always making sure the marks were in hidden places. It was an efficient tool of persuasion, and he was sure it would be just as effective on 2 little children who had forgotten their place in the world. That afternoon, Edward personally supervised the preparations. The brand was placed over glowing embers in the stable farthest from the main house, where screams would not be easily heard. He tested the temperature by quickly touching a wooden stick to the incandescent metal, satisfied when the wood instantly scorched. "Perfect," he murmured, imagining the moment he would brand those defiant little girls. "Let's see if they still have the courage to steal what isn't theirs after this." While Edward planned his cruel revenge, Isabella played innocently with Sophia near their shack, unaware that she had fallen into a carefully laid trap. Hunger would soon return, and with it, the desperate need that would force her back to the ranch. The predator was ready, and the prey was walking straight into the web. 3 days had passed since the first nightly raid, and hunger had returned with a cruel vengeance. The stolen eggs had provided only temporary relief, and now Isabella watched Sophia waste away again. The little girl had stopped playing, spending most of her time lying on the thin mattress. Her eyes glazed and her breathing shallow. "Bella," Sophia murmured in a weak voice, "my tummy hurts again. It hurts a lot." Isabella felt her heart shatter once more. She had tried to find work, to beg on the streets, to find any solution that didn't involve stealing again. But the small town offered few opportunities, and people were increasingly reluctant to help two orphans who always seemed to be in need. During her walks through town, in search of food or work, Isabella had heard a piece of news that lit a small flame of hope in her chest. At the bakery, while gazing through the window at golden loaves she couldn't afford, she overheard two women talking about the wealthy rancher. "I heard Edward Sinclair is away on business," one of them said, adjusting her purse on her arm. "Jake mentioned he'll be gone for at least 5 days. Can you imagine? And that huge ranch all empty. He could stand to share a little of that wealth," the other replied with a sigh. "But men like him only think about making more and more money." Isabella absorbed every word like a divine revelation. If the cruel rancher was traveling, maybe it was possible to get more eggs without the risk of being caught. Sophia urgently needed food, and the temporarily abandoned property seemed to be the answer to her prayers. That night, she prepared Sophia for another nightly mission. The little girl was even weaker than the first time, but her eyes lit up with a small spark of hope when Isabella mentioned fresh eggs. "The mean man isn't there?" Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No, little one. He's gone far away on a trip. The ranch is empty, like an abandoned castle waiting for two brave princesses." They left the shack in the dead of night, following the same path as before. Isabella carried Sophia on her back again, feeling the alarmingly light weight of her sister. The girl seemed to have lost even more weight in the last few days, and Isabella knew she couldn't wait much longer before Sophia became too weak to recover. The property was shrouded in darkness, just as Isabella had expected. There were no lights on in the mansion, and the silence was absolute except for the soft sound of the fountains in the gardens. She felt more confident this time, moving with greater assurance along the paths she now knew. The chicken coop was just as they had left it. Isabella helped Sophia through the gap in the wall, and the two headed quickly for the white and red structure. The side window was still slightly ajar, making entry easy. "Stay here and keep watch again," Isabella whispered. "If you see anything strange, call me." She entered the chicken coop with quicker, more efficient movements this time. The chickens recognized her and barely stirred as she passed their perches. Isabella collected the eggs with growing practice, once again filling the plastic container and the cloth bag. It was as she was climbing out of the window that she noticed something different. A faint light had come on in the mansion, right in the window overlooking the coop. Isabella froze, holding her breath, hoping the light would go out again. But the light stayed on, and worse, it began to move. Someone was walking through the house with a lantern or a candle, heading toward the back of the property. "Sophia," she whispered urgently, "we have to get out of here now." But when she turned to grab her sister, Isabella saw a tall, imposing figure emerging from the shadows near the coop. Edward Sinclair appeared like a vengeful ghost, his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction in the dim light of the lantern he carried. "Well, well," he said in a low, threatening voice. "The little thieves returned, just as I predicted." Isabella's blood ran cold. The rancher hadn't traveled at all. It had all been a carefully laid trap, and they had walked right into it. "Run!" she screamed to Sophia. But Edward was faster. He moved with surprising agility for a man his age, blocking the girl's escape route. There's nowhere to run now," he said with a smile that sent a chill down Isabella's spine. "You trespassed on my property, stole my belongings, and now you're going to learn that actions have consequences." Sophia began to cry, Running to hide behind her older sister, Isabella hugged her protectively, feeling the small body tremble with fear against hers. "Please, sir," Isabella tried to negotiate. "We just wanted food so we wouldn't starve. We'll never do it again." "I promise. A thief's promise is worthless," Edward replied coldly. "But don't worry. After the lesson I'm about to give you, I'm sure you'll never forget your place." He pointed the lantern toward the far stable, where a reddish light glowed ominously through the ajar door. "We're going to take a little walk over there, and there you'll receive a mark that will stay with you for the rest of your lives. A permanent reminder that you don't mess with Edward Sinclair." Isabella held Sophia tighter, her heart pounding so fast it felt like it would leap from her chest. She had tried to save her sister from hunger, but now they were both trapped in a much worse situation. The cruel man was leading them toward the stable, where something terrible awaited them in the red shadows of the night. The stable was even more terrifying on the inside than Isabella had imagined. The reddish glow came from burning embers in an iron brazier, from which the handle of a cattle brand protruded menacingly. The metal at its tip glowed with a heat that made the air around it shimmer. Edward shoved the two girls into the stable, closing the heavy door behind him. The sound of the bolt sliding into place echoed like a final sentence, sealing the two orphans' fate inside that place that smelled of hay, leather, and fear. "Welcome to my private office," Edward said with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "This is where I solve problems with people who don't know how to respect boundaries." Isabella pulled Sophia to the farthest corner of the stable, her back against the rough wooden wall. Her eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for an escape route, but the only openings were the door Edward had locked and two small windows too high to reach. "Please," she tried again, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound brave. "We'll leave and never come back. We can work to pay for the eggs we took." Edward laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden beams of the ceiling. "Work? You're two useless pests. The only work you're good for is to serve as an example to others who might think of disrespecting me." He walked slowly to the brazier, his steps echoing on the dirt floor. With a thick leather glove, he grabbed the handle of the branding iron, lifting it so the girls could clearly see the incandescent metal at its tip. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, turning the iron so the light from the embers danced on the hot metal. "It's a very effective educational tool. Once someone receives my special mark, they never forget the lessons learned." Sophia was crying softly, hiding her face against Isabella's chest. The older girl felt her own tears burn her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. If they were going to die here, she would at least die protecting her little sister until the very end. "You are going to learn that there are consequences for stealing what is mine," Edward continued, approaching slowly like a predator, savoring the moment before the final attack. "This brand will remind you, and anyone who sees it, that you messed with the wrong person." The stable also housed a magnificent white horse, which had remained quiet in its stall at the back of the building. It was a purebred animal, with a coat that shone like snow in the light of the embers, and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening. The horse had watched everything in silence, but as Edward approached the girls with the brand in hand, the animal began to stir. Its ears twitched nervously, and it began to stamp its hooves on the stall floor, letting out small whinnies of discomfort. "Even Tempest is eager to see the show," Edward commented, referring to the horse. "He's witnessed other important lessons here. He's an intelligent animal. He knows when justice is being served." But the horse's behavior did not seem to be one of approval. Tempest shook his head vigorously, as if trying to deny what he was witnessing. His eyes, normally calm and serene, now shone with a growing agitation. Isabella noticed the animal's restlessness and felt a small spark of hope. The horse seemed as disturbed as she was by the cruelty that was about to unfold. For a moment, her eyes met the animal's, and she had the strange feeling that he was trying to communicate something to her. "Now," Edward said, testing the iron's temperature by bringing it close to a nearby wooden post, which immediately began to smoke and char. "I'll start with the little one. Children learn best when they see an example being set." He aimed the iron toward Sophia, who was trembling uncontrollably in Isabella's arms. The older girl instinctively stepped in front of her sister, extending her arms to protect her. "No!" Isabella screamed with all the strength she could muster. "If you're going to brand someone, brand me, leave her alone." Edward paused for a moment, considering the offer. "How touching," he said sarcastically. "The big sister wants to sacrifice herself, but don't worry, you'll both get your mark. I just decided to start with the little one, so you can watch and know exactly what's waiting for you." Tempest was becoming increasingly agitated. The horse began to kick its hooves harder against the stall wall, and its whinnies grew louder and more desperate. The magnificent animal seemed to be fighting against something, perhaps the ropes that held him, or perhaps his own peaceful nature. Edward raised the glowing iron, his eyes shining with a sickening satisfaction. "Now, little ones, you're going to learn that—" But his words were cut short by a deafening sound. Tempest had managed to break the ropes that tied him in the stall, and now he reared violently, his front hooves cutting through the air, dangerously close to Edward's head. The rancher turned in surprise, momentarily distracted from his victim. "Tempest! What's gotten into you, you stupid animal?" It was in that moment of distraction that Isabella saw her only chance. The iron was still in Edward's hand, but his attention was completely focused on the enraged horse. If she could create a bigger confusion, perhaps she could grab Sophia and run for the door. But before she could act, Tempest made a decision that would change everything. The white horse, with all the force of its powerful muscles, charged directly at Edward Sinclair. The impact was devastating. Tempest slammed into Edward with the full force of his powerful muscles, hitting him in the chest and sending him flying backward like a rag doll. The rancher landed heavily on the dirt floor, and the cattle brand slipped from his hand, spinning through the air in a deadly arc. Isabella watched in horror as the incandescent metal descended toward Edward himself. The iron struck his right leg, just above the knee, and the thin fabric of his pajama pants offered no protection against the brutal heat. The smell of burning flesh instantly filled the stable. Edward's scream echoed off the wooden walls like the howl of a wounded animal. It was a sound Isabella had never heard before, pure desperation and physical pain mixing in a terrible symphony. He writhed on the ground, clutching his burned leg as tears of agony streamed down his face. "My leg! My leg!" he screamed repeatedly, his voice breaking with pain. The man who moments before had planned to brand two defenseless children was now experiencing on his own flesh the cruelty he was about to inflict. Tempest stood near Edward for a few seconds, looking down at him as if to make sure the threat had been neutralized. The white horse snorted once, shook his majestic head, and then turned toward the terrified girls in the corner of the stable. Isabella was in total shock, holding a hysterically crying Sophia. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The horse, an animal she didn't even know, had risked everything to protect them. It was as if a higher power had sent a four-legged angel to save them at the last moment. Tempest approached the girls slowly, with careful, deliberate movements. His eyes, which had blazed with fury during the confrontation, now showed a surprising gentleness. He lowered his head until it was level with Isabella's, as if to comfort her. "He saved us," Isabella whispered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch the horse's soft muzzle. "You saved us." Tempest gently nudged the girl's hand with his muzzle, a gesture that seemed full of understanding and compassion. It was as if the animal knew exactly what had happened and wanted to assure the girls that they were now safe. Edward continued to writhe on the floor, his screams diminishing to pained groans. The burn on his leg was severe, and he knew he would need urgent medical attention. But more than the physical pain, it was the humiliation that consumed him. He had been defeated by his own victims and by the animal he considered his property. "Run," he managed to mutter through clenched teeth. "Run before I recover and make you pay for this." But his threats sounded hollow now. Edward was clearly incapacitated, and Tempest remained vigilant, like a protective guardian of the two orphans. Isabella helped Sophia to her feet, their legs still shaking from fear and adrenaline. "Let's go, little one," she said in a soft voice. "We need to get out of here now." To her surprise, as she headed for the stable door, Tempest followed them. The horse seemed determined to escort them off the property, as if understanding that his mission of protection was not yet complete. The door was unlocked. Edward had forgotten to slide the bolt back after the impact. Isabella opened it carefully, checking for any more dangers outside. The garden was silent, lit only by the moon that had emerged from behind the clouds. "Are you coming with us?" she asked Tempest, knowing the animal probably couldn't understand her, but feeling the need to include him in their escape. To her surprise, the horse dipped his head as if nodding. Then he lowered himself slightly, as if offering his back for the girls to ride. Isabella looked at Sophia, who had stopped crying and was now watching the horse with awe and gratitude. "He wants to help us escape," Isabella said, hardly believing the surreal situation they were in. Carefully, she helped Sophia onto the horse's back, then mounted behind her sister, holding her tightly. Tempest rose slowly, adjusting to the weight of the two small children. "Thank you," Isabella whispered into the horse's ear. "Thank you for saving us." And then, in the dead of night, an almost magical scene unfolded in the gardens of Blackwood Ranch. A white horse galloped silently along the stone paths, carrying on its back two orphan girls who had found an unlikely protector in the darkest moment of their lives. Behind them, in the stable, Edward Sinclair continued to groan in pain. Clutching his burned leg and understanding for the first time in his life that there were forces in the universe greater than his money and power. The cattle brand lay on the floor beside him, cold now, but carrying a lesson he would never forget. Tempest led the girls to the opening in the wall where they had entered, stopping gently so they could dismount. But when Isabella tried to say goodbye, the horse shook its head again, indicating that he had no intention of leaving them there. The four-legged protector had made a decision. He would follow the girls wherever they went, ensuring they would never go through something like that again. The freedom he had just won would be used to protect two innocent children who had touched something deep in his animal soul. The escape had been successful, but it was only the beginning of a journey that would change all of their lives forever. Dawn found an unusual scene on the road leading to town. Two girls slept soundly, leaning against a white horse that remained vigilant, its ears twitching at every different sound. Tempest had led Isabella and Sophia far from the ranch during the night, stopping only when he found a grove of eucalyptus trees that offered shelter and shade. Isabella awoke to the sound of an approaching engine. Her eyes snapped open, her protective instincts making her jump up to check for danger. A green Jeep was coming down the dusty road, slowing down as the driver spotted the unlikely group. Dr. Carlos Aguilar had left home early to attend to a mare in labor at a neighboring ranch. At 45, he was the only veterinarian in the region, known for his dedication to animals and his genuine kindness to everyone he met. Graying hair framed a gentle face, and his brown eyes reflected the wisdom of someone who had spent decades caring for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. When he saw the two dirty, thin children next to a clearly valuable purebred horse, Dr. Aguilar stopped the jeep immediately. Something about the scene didn't add up, and his experience told him there was an important story behind the strange situation. "Good morning," he said in a soft voice, getting out of the vehicle slowly so as not to frighten the girls. "Are you two okay? Do you need help?" Isabella instinctively pulled Sophia closer, her recent experience with adults leaving her wary. But there was something different about this man. His movements were calm, and his eyes showed genuine concern, not the cruel coldness she had seen in Edward. "We're fine," Isabella lied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "We're just resting." Dr. Aguilar observed the girls more closely. Dirty, patched clothes, thin faces that betrayed hunger, and above all, their eyes. There was something in those eyes that spoke of recent terror. As a vet, he had developed the ability to read signs that others ignored, in both animals and people. But it was when his eyes turned to Tempest that Dr. Aguilar became truly intrigued. He immediately recognized the horse as a purebred Lusitano, an animal easily worth tens of thousands of dollars. It wasn't the kind of animal orphan children would own. "What a beautiful horse," he commented, slowly extending a hand toward the animal. "May I touch him?" Tempest watched him carefully, then dipped his head slightly as if giving permission. Dr. Aguilar approached and began to examine the animal with experienced hands, checking for injuries or signs of mistreatment. "He seems very well cared for," he said, noting the exceptional quality of the coat and the well-developed muscles. "This is a high-quality animal. Do you know his owner?" Isabella exchanged a nervous glance with Sophia. How could she explain that they had fled with the horse after he saved their lives? How could she tell him that the owner had tried to brand them with a hot iron? He followed us," she finally said, opting for a simplified version of the truth. "I think he likes us." Dr. Aguilar frowned slightly. In his years of experience, he had learned that purebred horses like Tempest didn't just follow people randomly. There was more to this story, and he suspected the girls were in some kind of trouble. "Listen," he said, kneeling to be at their level. "My name is Dr. Aguilar, and I take care of animals. I can see you've been through something difficult. You don't have to tell me now, but if you want to talk, I'd like to help." Isabella studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his voice, and something in his eyes vaguely reminded her of the father she had lost, but she was still too scared to fully trust a stranger. "We didn't do anything wrong," she said defensively. "I'm sure you didn't," Dr. Aguilar replied gently, "but you look tired and hungry. How about you come to my clinic? I can offer you a proper breakfast and a place for the horse to rest while we talk." Sophia tugged on Isabella's sleeve, whispering something in her ear. The older girl nodded and looked at Dr. Aguilar. "My sister wants to know if you have real food," she said with touching honesty. Dr. Aguilar's heart ached. "I do. Scrambled eggs, warm bread, fresh milk, and some apples that I'm sure Tempest would love." Upon mentioning the horse's name, Dr. Aguilar noticed an interesting reaction. The girls looked at each other in surprise, and Tempest perked up his ears. "You know his name?" Isabella asked. "Of course," Dr. Aguilar replied, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. "Tempest is one of the most famous horses in the region. He belongs to Edward Sinclair from Blackwood Ranch. In fact, I got a strange call from him early this morning. Said the horse had run off and that if I saw him, I should return him immediately." Isabella turned pale. If the vet knew Tempest belonged to Edward, he would surely return them, and if Edward found them again. But, Dr. Aguilar continued, watching the girl's reaction, animals don't run away for no reason, especially well-treated horses like Tempest. They run when they're trying to escape something bad. He stood up slowly, making a decision that would change everything. How about this? You come with me. Eat something decent, get some rest, and then we'll talk about what really happened. I promise I won't call anyone until I understand the whole story. Isabella looked at Sophia, who nodded eagerly at the prospect of real food. Then she looked at Tempest, who took a few steps toward the jeep, as if approving the decision. "Okay," she said finally, "but if you try to hurt us or turn us over to bad people—" "I understand," Dr. Aguilar interrupted gently. "Trust is hard when you've been hurt, but I promise you, on the memory of every animal I've ever cared for, that you will be safe with me." And so, a new chapter began in the lives of the two orphans, now under the protection not only of a brave horse, but also of a man whose profession was to heal and protect the defenseless. The Aguilar Veterinary Clinic was at the edge of town, a simple but welcoming building painted white with blue trim. Dr. Aguilar drove the jeep around to a side entrance, where there was a fenced-in yard with green grass and a few fruit trees. It was the perfect place for Tempest to rest while the girls recovered. "You can leave the horse here," Dr. Aguilar said, opening the gate to the yard. "There's fresh water in that trough, and I'll get some feed in a moment." Isabella and Sophia got out of the jeep carefully, still wary despite the vet's kindness. Tempest followed them into the yard. Staying close like a vigilant guardian, the horse clearly had no intention of leaving the girls he had chosen to protect. "Come on!" Dr. Aguilar guided them to a side door that led directly into his house, attached to the clinic. "My wife should be making breakfast right about now." The house was modest but extremely welcoming. Light wood furniture, floral curtains, and the wonderful smell of fresh coffee and homemade bread wafted through the air. Isabella's stomach growled violently, reminding her that they hadn't had a proper meal in several days. "Carlos, is that you?" A female voice called from the kitchen. "Yes, Maria, and I've brought some special visitors." Maria Aguilar emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a floral apron. She was a motherly-looking woman, with brown hair tied in a bun and kind eyes that widened when she saw the two dirty, thin girls. "Oh, my goodness," she murmured, rushing toward them. "Who are these little girls? Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Maria's instinctive reaction was to kneel and check the girls for injuries, her maternal hands gently touching their thin faces. It was a gesture so full of affection that Isabella felt tears burn her eyes. "They need food, a bath, and clean clothes," Dr. Aguilar said. "And they also need a lot of love. They've been through something terrible." Maria didn't ask questions. Instinctively, she wrapped the two girls in a warm hug that smelled of lavender and safety. "Of course, my dears. Come, we'll take good care of you." Sophia melted into the hug, crying softly with relief. Isabella resisted for a few seconds, but then allowed herself to be comforted by this woman who radiated motherly kindness. "First, let's get you a nice warm bath," Maria said. "Then we'll eat until we can't eat anymore." "How does that sound? Can I see Tempest from the window?" Isabella asked, still worried about her protective horse. "Of course you can, sweetie. The kitchen window looks out onto the yard. You can keep an eye on him the whole time." Dr. Aguilar watched the interaction between his wife and the girls, his heart warming. Maria had always had an extraordinary maternal instinct, but after losing their only daughter in an accident 5 years earlier, she had channeled all that love into caring for the injured animals that came to the clinic. Now, seeing her with Isabella and Sophia, Dr. Aguilar realized that this was an opportunity for healing for everyone involved. While Maria took the girls for their bath, Dr. Aguilar tended to Tempest. The horse accepted the feed and water, but kept his eyes fixed on the house, clearly concerned about the girls. "You really care about them, don't you, boy?" Dr. Aguilar murmured, stroking the animal's neck. "Something terrible happened at that ranch. I can feel it." Tempest snorted softly, as if confirming the vet's suspicions. Half an hour later, two unrecognizable girls came down to the kitchen. With clean clothes borrowed from Maria, their hair washed and combed, and their faces clean, Isabella and Sophia looked like normal children for the first time in months. "There we go," Maria exclaimed, clapping her hands. "Sit down here at the table. I've made scrambled eggs, bacon, warm toast, fruit, and fresh milk." The meal that followed was almost sacred. Isabella and Sophia ate with a silent gratitude that deeply moved the couple. There was no rush, no fear, just the simple pleasure of a good meal in a safe place. "Now," Dr. Aguilar said gently when they had finished, "how about you tell me what really happened?" Isabella exchanged a look with Sophia, then took a deep breath. For the first time since their parents' death, she felt she could trust someone. Slowly, she began to tell the whole story: the hunger, the first theft of eggs, Edward's trap, the branding iron, and Tempest's heroic rescue. Maria covered her mouth with her hands, horrified. Dr. Aguilar clenched his fists, his face darkening with anger as the story unfolded. "That monster," Maria murmured when Isabella finished. "Ach, how could a human being do that to children?" "Edward Sinclair has always been cruel," Dr. Aguilar said, "but this crosses every line. He has to pay for what he did." "No," Isabella stood up, frightened. "If he finds out we told, he'll try to get revenge. He has a lot of money, a lot of influence. No one will believe two orphans against a rich man." Dr. Aguilar rose and knelt in front of Isabella, holding her small, trembling hands. "Listen to me, Isabella. You are not alone anymore. Maria and I will protect you no matter what. No one is going to hurt you again. You can stay here as long as you need," Maria added, wiping tears from her own eyes. "This house has been too empty for too long. You've brought life back into it." Sophia got up from her chair and ran to hug Maria. "Can you be our mom for now?" she asked with the touching innocence of a 4-year-old. Maria hugged her tightly, her own tears now falling freely. "Of course, I can, my angel. Of course I can." Outside, Tempest watched the scene through the kitchen window, as if he knew he had found the right place to leave his charges, but he would not let his guard down. Edward Sinclair was a dangerous man, and he would certainly not give up on his revenge easily. While the girls experienced the feeling of safety and affection for the first time in months, the atmosphere at Blackwood Ranch was one of chaos and fury. Edward Sinclair had managed to drag himself from the stable to the main house using a stick for support, leaving a trail of blood on the stone path. The burn on his leg was deep and excruciatingly painful. The fabric of his pants had fused to the burned flesh, and every movement sent waves of agony through his body. But stronger than the physical pain was the humiliation consuming his proud soul. "Jake!" he shouted as he staggered into the mansion. "Jake!" "Get in here immediately." The ranch manager came running, his eyes widening when he saw his boss in a deplorable state, clothes torn, covered in dirt and blood, clutching his injured leg. "My God, boss, what happened? You need to go to the hospital." "No hospital," Edward snarled, leaning heavily on the entryway table. "Call Dr. Roberts, that private doctor who doesn't ask questions. And then I want you to organize a search. 2 miserable orphans stole my horse and fled the property." Jake was confused. "Orphans stole Tempest, but boss, how could 2 kids "Do as I say," Edward interrupted with a fury that made Jake flinch. "I want every employee looking for them. Offer a reward for any information, and send someone to check if that idiot vet has seen anything." As Jake rushed to carry out the orders, Edward dragged himself to his office and collapsed into his leather armchair. The pain was unbearable, but his thirst for revenge was even greater. No one, least of all two insignificant orphans, could humiliate him like this and get away with it. Dr. Roberts arrived in less than an hour, a middle-aged physician who had discreetly treated various accidents involving Edward's employees over the years. He examined the burn without asking how it happened, simply cleaning and bandaging the wound. "Now it's going to leave a permanent scar," he informed him while applying analgesic ointment, "and you'll walk with a limp for the rest of your life. The iron hit important muscles and tendons." Edward received the news in silence, but inside he was seething with hatred. The brand he had planned for the girls was now seared into his own flesh. It was a cruel irony that fueled his need for revenge even more. "You need complete rest for at least 2 weeks, the doctor continued, "and avoid any physical exertion." "Doctor," Edward interrupted him coldly, "treat the wound and leave. I have important matters to attend to." After the doctor left, Edward began to systematically work on his plan for revenge. He would use all his influence, all his money, his entire network of contacts to find those girls and make them pay for what they had done. He called local authorities, spreading a distorted version of the facts. According to his narrative, 2 orphan girls had invaded his property, grievously injuring him during a robbery and fleeing with his prize horse. He painted himself as the victim of a barbaric crime. "Sheriff," he said on the phone, using his most persuasive tone, "these children are clearly dangerous. They managed to attack me and steal an animal worth a fortune. I need you to organize an immediate search." The sheriff, accustomed to catering to the requests of the wealthiest man in the region, promised to mobilize all available resources. Edward also called other influential ranchers, creating a surveillance network that would spread throughout the region. He offered generous rewards for information on the whereabouts of the girls and the horse. "I want everyone to know," he said in a makeshift meeting with his most loyal henchmen, "or that anyone who helps these criminals will automatically become my enemy, and you know how I treat my enemies." Edward's influence in the region was vast. He controlled jobs, financing, businesses that supported dozens of families. Few people would have the courage to challenge him openly, even to protect 2 innocent children. While plotting his revenge, Edward also planned preventive measures to ensure nothing similar would happen again. He hired more security for the ranch, installed cameras at vulnerable points, and ordered electrified fences to be installed around the entire property. "Never again," he muttered to himself, watching the gardens where it all began through the window. "I will never be humiliated by anyone again, much less by 2 miserable orphans." But there was something Edward didn't know. Dr. Aguilar had decided not only to protect the girls, but also to investigate the rancher's crimes more deeply. The vet had his own connections in the region, people who had witnessed Edward's abuses for years, but had never found the courage to report him. The battle between the influence of money and the force of justice was just beginning. Edward had power and resources, but Dr. Aguilar had something the rancher had never possessed, the genuine loyalty of people who respected him for his kindness, not out of fear. At the veterinary clinic, Isabella watched Tempest through the kitchen window, unaware that a much bigger storm was gathering on the horizon. Edward Sinclair had decided to use all his power to destroy anyone who dared to protect his small victims. The silent war between good and evil had just begun, and the fate of 2 innocent orphans would depend on who emerged victorious from this unequal battle. The man who had tried to brand two children with a hot iron now bore his own mark of cruelty, but it had only made his thirst for revenge even more dangerous. 2 days had passed since Isabella and Sofia found refuge in Dr. Aguilar and Maria's home. For the first time in months, the girls knew what it felt like to sleep in soft beds, eat regular meals, and most importantly, feel safe. Sofia had even started smiling again, playing in the garden while Tempest grazed peacefully in the yard. But the peace was to be short-lived. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Aguilar answered a call that would change everything. It was Sheriff Miller, a man he had known for years, but whose voice sounded strangely formal and tense. "Dr. Aguilar, I need to speak with you about a sensitive matter. Can I stop by the clinic?" "Of course, Sheriff. Has something happened? It's better if we talk in person." Dr. Aguilar hung up the phone with a bad feeling. He instructed Maria to keep the girls inside the house and went to wait for the sheriff at the clinic, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. Sheriff Miller arrived with 2 deputies, which confirmed Dr. Aguilar's worst fears. He was a middle-aged man with a graying mustache and an uncomfortable expression, like someone being forced to do something against his will. "Dr. Aguilar," he began formally, "I've received a serious complaint. Edward Sinclair alleges that 2 orphan girls trespassed on his property, violently attacked him, and stole his horse. He said you might have information about their whereabouts." Dr. Aguilar kept his expression neutral, but inside his heart was pounding. Edward filed a complaint. How interesting. And did he happen to mention why 2 children, ages 8 and 4, would have a reason to attack him? According to his report, they were stealing food, and when he tried to stop them, they injured him severely and fled with the horse. "And you believe that version, Sheriff?" The older lawman sighed heavily. "Dr. Aguilar, we've known each other a long time. I know what kind of man you are, but Edward Sinclair has considerable influence. He's pressuring me to conduct a full-scale search. And what if I told you these children are under my protection because they were victims of an attempted assault? You'd have to present evidence, and frankly, it would be your word against one of the most powerful men in the county." Dr. Aguilar saw the difficult position the sheriff was in. Miller was an honest man, but he also had a family to support and couldn't afford to make powerful enemies. "And to give me 24 hours?" Dr. Aguilar requested. "If these girls were here, I need time to understand the whole situation before getting them involved in legal matters." The sheriff reluctantly agreed. 24 hours, Dr. Aguilar. After that, I can't ignore the pressure any longer." After the police left, Dr. Aguilar hurried back to the house. Maria was in the kitchen with the girls, who immediately noticed his worried expression. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked, always alert to signs of danger. Dr. Aguilar sat at the kitchen table, choosing his words carefully. "Edward filed a report against you. He said you attacked him and stole Tempest." Isabella's face turned pale. "He lied. We didn't attack anyone. It was Tempest who saved us when he was going to... I know, sweetie. I believe you. But now we need to figure out what to do." Maria held Sofia's trembling hands. "We're not going to let anyone hurt you," she said with maternal firmness, "but we have to be smart." That night, Dr. Aguilar made a few discreet calls to colleagues and friends in the area. What he discovered worried him even more. Edward had mobilized a full-blown campaign against the girls, offering rewards and spreading his version of events to anyone who would listen. "He's hired private security," reported Dr. Antonio, a vet from the neighboring town. "And they're offering money for any information about 2 orphans and a white horse. The story is spreading fast." But there was also good news. Other people began to share their own experiences with Edward Sinclair. The retired teacher, Mrs. Gable, called to talk about the time she had seen the rancher humiliate his workers. The shopkeeper, Mr. Johnson, mentioned employees who had shown up at his store with suspicious injuries. "That man has been a monster for years," Mrs. Gable said, "but no one ever had the courage to report him. Maybe now, with these children, it's time to do something." Dr. Aguilar realized he was facing a unique opportunity. If he could organize the right people, he might not only be able to protect Isabella and Sophia, but also expose Edward's crimes once and for all. The next morning, he made a brave decision. He called a few journalists from regional newspapers, telling them the real version of events. He also contacted human rights and child protection organizations. "Are you willing to fight?" he asked Isabella and Sophia during breakfast. "Because if we're going to face Edward Sinclair, we need to do this right. We can't just hide. We need to show everyone who he really is." Isabella held Sophia's hand and nodded with determination. "He's hurt a lot of people, hasn't he? Not just us." "Unfortunately." "Yes? Then we'll fight," the 8-year-old said with a courage that impressed the adults. "We can't let him keep hurting other children." Maria hugged the two girls. "Then we'll do it together. A real family faces problems together." Outside, Tempest watched through the window as if he understood the battle was just beginning. The horse that had protected two orphans was now part of a much larger fight, the fight between justice and corruption. Between the protection of the innocent and power without scruples, Edward Sinclair had underestimated the power of human kindness. He would soon discover that some people were willing to risk everything to protect two children who had suffered enough. The war was declared, and this time the weak would not fight alone. The week that followed was an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Dr. Aguilar had managed to mobilize more support than he expected. Mrs. Gable, the retired teacher, had meticulously documented years of abuses committed by Edward, Mr. Johnson, the shopkeeper, convinced 3 former ranch employees to testify about the inhumane working conditions and cruel punishments. But Edward did not stand idle. His influence spread like tentacles throughout the region, pressuring officials, threatening businesses, and offering bribes disguised as donations to anyone who stood by him. The situation reached a critical point when Sheriff Miller showed up at the clinic, accompanied by a social worker and 2 state troopers. "Dr. Aguilar," the sheriff said with a grave expression, "I have orders from higher up. The girls need to be taken in for a statement and evaluation. Edward Sinclair has filed a formal lawsuit." Isabella and Sophia were playing in the garden when they saw the official cars arrive. They instinctively ran into the house, where Maria hugged them protectively. "You're not taking them," Maria said firmly. "These children have suffered enough." The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mr. Hayes, approached gently. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we have to follow legal protocols. The girls will be treated well, I promise." "Protocols," Dr. Aguilar intervened. "Where were the protocols when 2 orphans were starving to death? Where were they when a grown man tried to brand them with a hot iron?" The sheriff sighed. "Doctor, I know your intentions are good, but I can't ignore a court order. Edward got a search and seizure warrant." It was then that Isabella surprised everyone. The 8-year-old girl stepped out from behind Maria and addressed the officers directly. "I'll go with you," she said with a courage that belied her age, "but I want everyone to know the truth. I want to tell everyone what that mean man tried to do to us." Sophia began to cry, clinging to Maria's skirt. "I don't want Bella to go." Dr. Aguilar knelt in front of Isabella. "You don't have to do this, sweetie. We'll find another way." "Yes, I do," Isabella replied, showing an impressive determination. "If I don't tell the truth now, he'll keep hurting other people." And I promised Mum and Dad I would always protect Sophia. Ms. Hayes was visibly touched by the girl's maturity. Isabella, are you saying you have important things to tell us? I do, a lot of things, and I want you to record everything so no one can say I'm lying. An hour later, at the sheriff's station, a small crowd had gathered. News that the orphans who had attacked Edward Sinclair were giving their statements had spread quickly. Outside the building, supporters from both sides were clustered. Edward arrived in a wheelchair, flanked by his expensive lawyers and a few hired goons. His bandaged leg was displayed as proof of his victimization, and he nodded to some important people who had come to show their support. On the other side, a smaller but determined group gathered around Dr. Aguilar and Maria. Mrs. Gable held a folder full of documents. Mr. Johnson was nervous but firm in his decision to testify. Other local residents, simple people Edward had humiliated over the years, found the courage to show up. Inside the station, Isabella sat before a video camera with Sophia in her lap and Maria by her side for emotional support. The district attorney, D.A. Reynolds, had decided to personally conduct the deposition after receiving information about the seriousness of the accusations. Isabella, the D.A. began gently, I want you to tell me, in your own words, everything that happened. Don't be afraid. We're here to protect you. And then, with a clarity surprising for an 8-year-old, Isabella began to narrate the entire story. She spoke of the hunger, the desperation of watching Sophia waste away, the first trip to the ranch gates to ask for help. He looked at us like we were disgusting animals, she said, her words being recorded for posterity. He said we deserved to be hungry because we didn't try hard enough. She told of the desperate decision to take eggs, of Edward's cruel trap, and then, her voice trembling but firm, of what happened in the stable. He said he was going to brand us with a hot iron, she revealed, showing where Edward had pointed the glowing brand. He said we were going to learn a lesson we would never forget. He wanted to start with Sophia because he wanted me to watch. Sophia, though small, confirmed parts of the story with her childlike language. The mean man had fire, she said, gesturing with her little hands. Tempest saved us. Tempest is a hero. When Isabella finished her account, a heavy silence filled the room. Even the D.A., accustomed to difficult cases, was visibly shaken. And you are sure about everything you've told us? He asked. I am, and I know Tempest can confirm it. Animals don't lie. Do they? It was then that Dr. Aguilar had a brilliant idea. Mr. Reynolds, may I suggest something? How about we visit the stable where it all happened? If Tempest recognizes the place and shows agitation, that could be evidence of the trauma he also suffered. Edward, who was watching everything on a monitor in another room, turned pale. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but the rancher shook his head vigorously. The moment of truth had arrived. In a few hours, a convoy would head to Blackwood Ranch, where Tempest would have a chance to silently testify about the horrors he had witnessed. Edward knew his empire of fear and cruelty was about to crumble, but he still had one last card to play. If he couldn't destroy the girls through the law, he would use more direct methods. The final battle was about to begin, and this time it would be fought on the very territory where it all started. The convoy that headed to Blackwood Ranch the following afternoon was an unusual mix of officials, witnesses, and a small crowd of supporters. D.A. Reynolds led the official group, accompanied by a forensic team and police officers. Dr. Aguilar transported Tempest in a special trailer, with Isabella and Sophia by his side, protected by Maria and the social worker. Edward awaited them at the ranch's golden gates, still in his wheelchair. Surrounded by his lawyers and some hired muscle, His face wore a mask of outrage, but his eyes betrayed the fear of a man who knew his world was collapsing. "This is an outrage," he protested as the convoy arrived. "Turning my private property into a circus to satisfy the fantasies of two lying orphans." "Mr. Sinclair," the DA said calmly, "this is an official investigation. Your cooperation is mandatory." The group proceeded first to the stable where the main events had taken place. The place was exactly as Isabella had described, the brazier still in the same spot, marks on the dirt floor, and the stall where Tempest had been tied. When the horse was led into the stable, his reaction was immediate and dramatic. Tempest began to whinny agitatedly, rearing and refusing to approach the spot where the branding iron was still kept. When Dr. Aguilar brought the iron near the brazier, the animal became completely frantic. "See," said Isabella, pointing at Tempest. "He remembers everything. He remembers the fear we felt." The forensic team meticulously photographed everything. They found traces of blood on the floor where Edward had fallen, marks of agitated hooves in the dirt, and most importantly, they discovered fabric threads on the branding iron that matched the clothes Edward was wearing on the night of the incident. "These threads prove the iron was recently in use," the lead investigator explained. "And based on where they were found, they are consistent with an accident during the handling of the tool." Edward tried to protest, but his original story began to fall apart. If he had been attacked by the girls while trying to stop them, how could he explain being in the stable with a heated branding iron? The situation worsened when Mrs. Gable presented her documentation. For years, she had discreetly recorded Edward's abuses. Employees showing up with suspicious burns, families evicted from their land for trivial reasons, workers who disappeared after questioning their working conditions. "Here is the report on John Silver," she said, opening her organized folder. "An employee who was branded with a hot iron in 2018 after accidentally breaking a tool. Here, Maria Flores, evicted with her young children for asking for a raise." Mr. Johnson nervously stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, I myself saw that iron being used on people. Edward said it was to teach respect, but it was pure cruelty." One by one, other local residents found the courage to speak. The local shopkeeper told of threats he received when he questioned the prices Edward paid for goods. The town's laundress revealed the bloodstains she constantly cleaned from the ranch hands. "Clothes. For years, we lived in fear," said an elderly woman. "Edward controlled jobs, commerce, everything. Anyone who spoke against him lost their family's livelihood." The DA listened to each testimony with growing attention. It was clear that Isabella and Sophia's accusations were just the tip of a much larger iceberg of systematic abuse. Edward realized his strategy of playing the victim had completely failed. In desperation, he tried one last gambit. "Mr. Reynolds," he said in a trembling voice, "I admit that perhaps I have been overly severe with some employees, but that doesn't give these children the right to invade my property and steal my belongings." Mr. Sinclair, the D.A., replied coldly, "Attempted assault on a minor with a deadly weapon is a felony. Your other activities are merely aggravating factors." It was then that something unexpected happened. Edward looked at Isabella and Sophia, who were watching everything beside Maria, protected and loved. He saw how Tempest remained close to them, how Dr. Aguilar and Maria treated them like daughters, how the whole community had united to protect them. For the first time in his adult life, Edward Sinclair felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine remorse. Seeing those two children he had almost destroyed, now surrounded by love and protection, he understood the monstrosity of his actions. He began in a broken voice. "I almost killed two innocent children who just wanted food." His own lawyers tried to silence him, but Edward waved them away with a tired gesture. "No," he said, looking directly at Isabella. "No more lies. It's true, I tried to brand you with a hot iron. I wanted you to suffer, to learn to respect your place in the world." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward had just publicly confessed to his crimes, destroying any chance of a legal defense. "Why did you do it?" Isabella asked, her voice small but brave. Edward looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because I had become a monster. Because I thought my money gave me the right to decide who deserved to live with dignity and who deserved to suffer." Tears began to roll down his face, tears that seemed to carry decades of repressed cruelty. "You saved me," he said finally. "Tempest saved me. The pain I felt made me understand, for the first time, what I had inflicted on so many innocent people." The DA placed Edward Sinclair under arrest right then and there, but the rancher made one last request. "Do I want to use my entire fortune to repair the damage I've caused," he declared. "I want this ranch to become a help center for families in need. I want these children to have everything I tried to take from them: safety, education, love." Isabella approached the wheelchair where Edward was being handcuffed. "Thank you," she said simply. "Why?" he asked, confused. "Because now other children won't have to go through what we went through." It was the final demonstration of the purity of heart that Edward had tried to destroy, but which, ironically, ended up being the instrument of his own redemption. 6 months later, the former Blackwood Ranch had transformed into something no one could have imagined. The golden gates now displayed a simple sign: the Tempest Sanctuary, a home for hope. The manicured gardens had given way to community gardens where children and adults worked together, learning to cultivate not just food, but also dreams. Isabella walked through the halls of the old mansion, now converted into cozy dormitories, classrooms, and common areas. At 9 years old, she had grown not only in age, but in wisdom and compassion. Her eyes, which once reflected hunger and fear, now shone with the confidence of someone who has found her place in the world. "Bella, Bella," Sophia ran through the gardens, her pink, healthy cheeks a dramatic contrast to the emaciated girl who once cried from hunger in her sister's arms. At 5, she radiated the pure joy of a child who knows only love and security. "What is it, little one?" Isabella asked, crouching to receive Sophia in her arms. "And Daddy Carlos said Tempest had babies. Are you coming to see?" Isabella smiled, hearing Sophia refer to Dr. Aguilar as Daddy. The official adoption had been finalized 3 months ago, but the emotional bond had existed since their first shared breakfast in the couple's cozy home. The two girls ran toward the new stables, where a small crowd of children and adults was gathering around Tempest and his mare companion. 2 perfect foals. One white like his father, and the other piebald, wobbled on unsteady legs while their mother lovingly cleaned them. "They're beautiful," Sophia exclaimed, clapping her hands with joy. Dr. Aguilar approached the girls, his face radiating the happiness of a man who had found renewed purpose in life. Maria was by his side, holding Pedro, a 3-year-old boy who had arrived at the center the previous week, an orphan just as Isabella and Sophia had been. "Tempest is going to be a great father," Dr. Aguilar said, stroking the protective horse's neck, "just like he was a great guardian for you." The center now housed 15 orphaned or vulnerable children, in addition to providing support for more than 30 local families. The transformation had been made possible by Edward's resources, but mainly due to the tireless work of a community that had discovered the power of unity. Mrs. Gable had become the educational coordinator, creating a curriculum that blended formal education with human values. Mr. Johnson managed the agricultural co-op that sold the center's produce, ensuring financial sustainability. Other residents contributed their skills, teaching music, crafts, cooking, and most importantly, a lot of love. "Where is he today?" Isabella asked, referring to Edward. "In the library," Maria replied. He's finishing cataloguing the books he donated. Edward Sinclair had fulfilled his promise in an extraordinary way. In addition to donating his entire fortune to the center, he had chosen to work there as a volunteer after completing his community service sentence. The man who once inspired fear now dedicated his days to humble tasks, tending the gardens, organizing the library, helping in the kitchen. The transformation in Edward was visible not only in his actions, but in his demeanor. Where there was once arrogance and coldness, there was now genuine humility and a constant desire to repair the damage he had caused. He limped due to the permanent scar on his leg, a daily reminder that cruelty always returns to the one who practices it. Isabella decided to visit him in the library. She found Edward organizing children's books on a low shelf. His movements careful and respectful. When he saw her, he smiled shyly, a smile that still carried shame, but also gratitude. "Hello, Isabella. How are the foals?" "Beautiful. Tempest looks very proud." Edward nodded, turning his attention back to the books. In the first few months, their conversations had been awkward, but gradually a mutual understanding had developed. "Edward," Isabella said, using his first name without formalities for the first time, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you still angry sometimes? Angry that you lost everything?" Edward stopped arranging the books and looked at her in surprise. It was a deep question for a 9-year-old, but Isabella had learned to ask important questions. "You know what I discovered," he replied after a moment of reflection. "I didn't lose anything important. I lost things I thought made me happy, but which actually made me miserable. Money, power, the fear of others. That wasn't happiness." He gestured toward the library windows, where children were playing in the gardens while adults worked in the vegetable patches. "This right here is true wealth. Seeing you all happy, safe, growing, that's worth more than all the millions I had." Isabella nodded with wisdom beyond her years. "Daddy Carlos says that sometimes we have to lose everything to find what really matters. Your Daddy Carlos is a very wise man." That afternoon, as they did every day since the center opened, the community gathered for a communal dinner in the mansion's old ballroom. Simple wooden tables had replaced the ornate furniture, and the room echoed with laughter and lively conversation. Isabella watched the scene with deep contentment. Sophia chatted excitedly with other children about the foals. Dr. Aguilar and Maria coordinated the meal service with loving efficiency. Mrs. Gable told stories to the younger ones. Edward helped in the kitchen, working side by side with people who were once his victims and were now his companions on the journey. After dinner, as was tradition, all the children went out to the yard to say goodnight to Tempest and the other animals. The white horse remained the living symbol of protection and hope for the center, and his presence reassured both children and adults. Isabella mounted Tempest, as she did every night, with Sophia sitting in front of her. They rode slowly through the fields surrounding the center, watching the sunset paint the sky in gold and pink. "Bella," Sophia said, leaning against her sister's chest, "do you think Mom and Dad are watching us?" Isabella looked up at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I'm sure they are, and I think they're very proud." "Proud of what?" "Of how you've grown up strong and healthy, of how we found a family that loves us, of how even bad people can become good when they find real love." Sophia nodded sleepily, satisfied with the answer. When they returned to the center, Dr. Aguilar and Maria were waiting for them on the main porch. The family embraced silently, contemplating the miracle their lives had become. "We have 3 more children arriving tomorrow," Maria said. 7-year-old twin brothers and a 5-year-old girl. "We'll take good care of them," Isabella promised. "We'll show them there's always hope." Tempest whinnied softly, as if in agreement. The horse that had saved 2 orphans from a cruel fate now witnessed daily how love can transform lives, heal wounds, and create miracles. That night, as Isabella helped Sophia get ready for bed, the younger girl asked one last question. "Bella, do you think we'll live happily ever after?" Isabella smiled, remembering a time when happiness seemed impossible, when all they knew was hunger, fear, and abandonment. "I don't know if we'll be happy ever after," she answered honestly, "but I know we'll always have each other. And when people truly love each other, they always find a way to be happy together." Outside, Tempest grazed peacefully under the starlight, watching over the sleep of all the children who now called that place home. The horse that had witnessed so much cruelty was now the guardian of a sanctuary of love. The ranch, where the smell of money once contrasted with the misery of its surroundings, now exuded something far more valuable: the scent of renewed hope, of second chances, and of living proof that even in the hardest of hearts, compassion can flourish when watered by the example of true innocence. And so, 2 orphan girls who once begged for scraps at Golden Gates now helped to distribute hope to other children in need, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are born from the greatest tragedies, and that true love will always find a way to triumph over cruelty. The sun set over the Tempest sanctuary, but a new dawn always awaited on the horizon, full of infinite possibilities for those who believe in the transformative power of human kindness.